I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network, chatting with writers and authors who offer an added perspective for our listeners. This is The Color Between the Lines. In this edition of The Color Between the Lines, we're speaking with Tony Keith. He is a Black American gay poet, spoken word artist, and hip hop educator and leader from actually Washington, D.C. He's the author of a YA memoir called How the Boogeyman Became a Poet. Welcome, Tony Keith, to the BI.
It's funny. Thank you very much. Glad to be here. It's funny because I am a man essentially with two first names. And so I think I'm used to people sort of being like Keith.
Yeah, as your first name. Yeah.
Yeah.
First, I want to congratulate you on your book. You know, when
Thank
anybody
you.
embarks on writing a book, it takes time and it's a lot of effort that goes into it, and people don't quite realize what you put in when you finally birth this baby. It's a story about your life, growing
Yes.
up in high school, figuring out your sexuality, figuring out if you're gay or straight, and being the first in your family to go to college. I imagine that because of many of the references that you made about the church and about family and things and beliefs, writing this might have been kind of emotionally challenging.
Yeah.
Why did you choose to write it now? And what did you, I guess, emotionally have to overcome when you had to process
Yeah.
this?
Oh, wow. I love that question. Because you used the word emotionally, and the first thing I thought about was it was incredibly emotional. In fact, I was in therapy when I decided to write this, but this is the truth. So in 2019, I think I was 38 at the time. I'm in therapy, and I've been married to my husband for, well, 5 years now, but we had recently married. And yeah, I don't know, just sort of being in that much love was somehow awakened all this mess that I had. I had no idea, right? So I'm angry and I'm confused and like all this like suppressed stuff started coming up. And so, I'm in talk space therapy, and I'm going talking to my therapist, and I was like, we start talking about poetry. And he goes, after some time, well, Tony, that box of poems that you've been carrying around since you've been a kid, when is the last time you like looked at them? And I was like, I don't look at them. They just live in the box in my closet. And he goes, so your kid poems with all this emotion is maybe you should read them, And so that's what wound up happening. I spent a weekend reading
Wow.
these poems, and the poems are photocopied in this book, the ones that I decided to
Right.
include. But I read a bunch of them and I cried. Oh my gosh, I got angry a little bit. I tore some of them up, but I realized like this, I've been hoarding these emotions, like hoarding, literally dragging them around into my adulthood. And I was like, okay, I have to get free. And so it hit me, I was at a book signing event with one of my dear friends this was before I had a book out. This was actually a year later, February 2020. I'm at the University of South Carolina with my dear friend Jason Reynolds, and he's well known for books. And I'm on the stage performing, and there's always a book signing after every event we do together with these young people. And I'm sitting with him at this table, he's signing books, and there's a long line of people. And this Black woman gets out of line with, I'm assuming her son, it could be an aunt, I don't know, an adult woman and a younger Black boy. He comes right to me and he was like, "Where's your book?" And I was like, "What? Like what book? I don't have a book. I published on the stage." It was as if, like, Tony, the book that you have, like, where is it? Like, anyway. So I just told him, I don't know. I was like, maybe I'll write one for you or something like that. And I went back to my hotel room that night and I was like, I wonder if that little boy was questioning himself. Like, I wonder if he had some questions. And I wonder if maybe his mom did too. Maybe, like, where's the book for them? And then it turned into, Tony, where's the book that you would have needed? And considering the year before I had unpacked all those poems, I was like, oh, this has to go together. And then I fly back, from University of South Carolina, and COVID-19 hits. It was like
Wow.
nothing to do now, but write this book. As an artist and an educator, I was underemployed, and I was like, well,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow. That's an amazing story how that all came together. It's funny how some people, it's funny. I've been doing a little bit of a class in terms of being able to understand meditation and how people release different things, and how
Yes.
a lot of times when you said you had those things in a box, actually you, even though you had them in a box put away, you had them somewhere in your space,
Oh,
and you
yes.
to try to
Yes.
grapple with where they were and that space of yourself,
Yep.
because you've got your physical body, your emotional body, your spiritual body, and being able to capture and then release that, whatever
Yeah.
that is, in those emotional spaces. So that's quite
Yeah.
interesting how you talk about that. I love how you approach telling this book, telling the story in the book, because it isn't written in the traditional standard book style. It's kind of in a fluid style on the page. It's fluid.
Yes.
And explain how you chose to present the memoir growing, how you were growing up in that particular way.
I really appreciate this question because I'm so glad that I now have language for the thing that I've created is a memoir written in verse. And I did not have that language when I started writing this book, because I had never read anything like it. I naturally think kind of poetically. I've been writing poems since I was a kid, as readers will understand. And so I just sort of have a like rhythm and rhyme is just sort of a natural thing. But I was never able to write it like that in the academic world. And I have a whole PhD. And I always tried to like do this hybrid blending thing, but it was never accepted. And I always remembered, I reflect on this in the book too, is how my poetic voice was never really accepted in the standard. And so when I was able to when I finally got this deal with HarperCollins, and so my editor was like, Tony, play on the page. Play on the page. And the people who I thought that I know are also poets who play on the page also have written memoirs in verse or novels in verse. So Jacqueline Woodson, Brown Girl Dreaming, Chlorine Sky by Mahogany Brown. Elizabeth Acevedo has The Poet X. Candice Elo has Everybody Looking. And so I'm reading these other books for young adult readers that are also written in verse by people who are poets. And I'm like, oh, this thing that I naturally know how to do has there's
Yeah, it has
language for
a
it.
language,
It
yeah.
exists. Oh gosh. And so that's when it became fun. But the other part about that story is the title of the book is How the Boogeyman Became a Poet. And it came about because it's so interesting. I wrote a poem 10 years ago for a buddy of mine called me. He was having a bad day, and I was just trying to cheer him up on the phone. We're just sort of talking. And because I still process my emotions in poems. I wrote a poem after that conversation, sort of like a build yourself up, lift you up poem. It became the epilogue of this book, but the last line in that poem is, and so the boogeyman became a poet. And so when I thought about a title for this book, I was like, when I wrote that poem, I wrote that like for another person, but clearly if I had that line that it's about me too, all of my writing is for me too. And so I wrote this book, How Did the Boogeyman Become a Poet?
Mm.
Like how, and so writing it that way, sort of with the academic brain, like, oh, including the poems, including the pictures, writing it in verse, like that to me feels like the support. You know what I mean? Like, this is how I'm proving how the boogeyman became a poet, damn it. Like,
I figured one of the reasons maybe that you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you use this kind of fluidity because of your way of presenting. I mean, you're a poet that's on stage, and so the page was like a stage where you were
yes.
giving that performance.
Yes, and so glad you said it that way because I didn't. Again, I'm so grateful to have language like this now. But I think earlier today I said something similar. Like I think I finally learned how to perform words on the page. Now so I'm so glad you said that because like that's exactly the place that I think that I realize I am with my writing is I can really play around. And my editor, shout out to Ben Rosenthal and my agent Annie Huang. I remember him sort of granting me freedom, and this is really interesting to use that language in the writing sense. He's a younger white man, and to like grant me freedom to like express my voice in the way that I want to was a very like liberating sort of moment. Like, oh, I can play around. And the beauty in that is because I think about literacy a lot. And although I wrote this book for young adult readers, I was an English language arts teacher at a public charter school in Washington, D.C. last semester.
Mm.
And this was a class for adult learners who were pursuing their high school credentials, GED certifications. My oldest student was 65, right? And my youngest was like in the early 20s. And and I was teaching reading, and when I thought about a book, I was like, what book or what could they read that would be engaging? These are individuals who do not have a great relationship with writing or reading or language or literacy, just not. And so I read them excerpts when I had the PDF excerpts of my book. I read them excerpts from that, and then I had them read Jacqueline Woodson's Brown Girl Dreaming, the whole book, and they loved it. They loved it. 65-year-old woman finished 350 something pages of a book and was like, Dr. Keith, I've never done this before. And I was like, oh, they discovered the rhythm and the rhyme. It's engaging learners, especially Black learners. It's engaging.
I think that, how people learn and how people read is a lot different than perhaps many, many years ago. And being able to, acquire it's an art,
Yes.
of course, writing
Yes.
is an art, but being able to read and being able to understand things differently is now being accepted a lot more than in the
Yeah.
past. I wonder if you could just describe who is the boogeyman and why was he drawn to the poetry?
Yeah, how about that? So the boogeyman absolutely represents just probably the most extended metaphor I've ever written about in my entire life. But the boogeyman represents several sort of aspects of me. So it represents internalized racism, it represents internalized homophobia, and readers will learn that, I grew up in I'm a child of divorced parents. My father was addicted to drugs and alcohol, and my mom was a single mom, and it was a tough situation. And so I sort of grew up believing that I would never have and never be able to go to college. And so the boogeyman represented metaphorically in the mirror every day as a kid who I saw, who I believed I was. I was just too afraid. I was just too afraid of that person. And so I would hide, right? So I would code switch my language in classes so that teachers would say that I'm a good student, or I would code switch so that I could sort of perform straight, if that makes sense. Like I was sort of hiding from myself. And so the real me was the boogeyman that I would see in the mirror. But it was only, again, through poetry and being able to start sharing poetry on the stage and receiving sort of a positive reception from audiences when I began to understand something differently about poetry. It was sort of like, yo, the stuff that I write to myself individually, yeah, that's for me, but I can also do something that can be for other people, and I can share that out loud. Like there sort of became this moment of realizing my voice, and the power of voice. All of that sort of happens in this book. Yeah, I think that was a long-winded answer.
That's okay. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm Esther Dillard with the Black Information Network, speaking with Tony Keith, author of How the Boogeyman Became a Poet. I like the fact that with this book, you're not solely discovering your sexuality. I mean, that's part of it.
Yeah.
But if anybody picked up the book and thought that this was about just becoming gay or understanding that you were gay or whatever, in the sexual sense, it's not that. I feel like the boogeyman kind of morphs throughout
Yeah.
this memoir.
Yes.
Um, and I think you spoke about it a little bit just in the prior answer, talking about some of the things that you discovered about yourself. Were any of the discoveries surprising for you, or any particular thing that was surprising for you that you, when you were writing this, that you realized, oh, this was something I didn't realize that I overcame or I faced while as a teenager?
Oh, wow. That is a question I've not yet been asked. I love this. Um, and so the first thing that comes to mind absolutely is, I think the biggest discovery, I have to, this is the truth. The biggest discovery was knowing what the boogeyman was. This is the truth. And so this is the truth. I did not have an I so because I sort of write in a stream of conscious sort of way. And I feel like there's even an answer to this that I need to preface it with, but I'm gonna just go with more. I write in a stream of consciousness. And so when I started writing this book, I was writing like, okay, I know the boogeyman is going to show up, and I'm just going to keep letting this flow every day. I'm just going to kind of let it flow out. And it wasn't until I got to the middle of the book, and there's I don't want to give too much away, but there's a particular scene. I have a girlfriend in the book, and there's a very intimate scene between me and my girlfriend Blue in the book, and there's sort of this moment where I'm hearing the boogeyman's voice in a moment when you wouldn't think that would make sense, and it hit me like, Tony, the boogeyman is it's you. It's been you. Like, oh my gosh. And so then learning how to like land the plane, I won't say became easy, but I was like, oh, now that I've had this surprise moment, I know what the boogeyman means. I can extend this metaphor out. I can build up a story about triumph and a story about joy. Like I'm like, okay, I don't want to leave readers in this like, space, but I'm like, I have this clarity now. So that's what it was. I discovered that it was me the entire time, and that I told myself 10 years ago in a poem that I wrote to myself that I said was for somebody else.
Mm, mm. Please tell us about this EDMC Academy, or is it Ed? You
It's
tell
Ed
me.
and C Academy. It's okay. It's relatively brand new language, and I don't know the best way to make this a short story, but I'll do my best. My PhD is in education leadership. I got it in 2019 from George Mason University, and the reason why I say that is my PhD is I developed a theory about people who embody hip hop culture and their ways of being, who are also educators, right? Meaning hip hop culture, the broader, right? Culture meaning music and foods and dress and language and customs and beliefs and values. hip hop music is hip hop's music, but anyway, but who are poets, spoken word artists, rappers, and MCs. So what would happen is someone would usually say to me, Tony, what is it that you do? Right. And I would always give them the title of, I'm like, oh, I'm director of programs at this particular nonprofit. Oh, and I'm a poet. Right. Or like, it was always like this, and it was like
And
word soup. And other people who were just like me, because I'm not the only person, would also give people the same word soup. I'm a teaching artist. I'm a educator, scholar, poet. And I was like, we need language. And so for my dissertation, I interviewed people who were just like me all around the country, about 10 of us, like well-regarded poets, spoken word artists, rappers, and MCs who work in education. And I figured out a way to transform their told stories into little poems. And in one side, one of those poems was this language where this person says, he says, I've never called myself a rapper. I was always a poet. Rap is poetry timed. I'm an MC. MCs become educators letter-wise. The literal M and C could be master craftsman, master missive community. And I was like,
wow.
MCs become educational MC. I'm an ed MC. And so that language became a finding for my dissertation research, which won multiple awards from George Mason and the American Education Research Association. Anyway, so I've built now a for-profit business corporation where I'm hiring poets, spoken word artists, rappers, and MCs or ed MCs, and we do consulting work in education. So we work with libraries, schools, museums, colleges, universities. We say in places where educators are unmotivated, leaders are overwhelmed, students are disconnected. You know, we inspire instruction, we amplify the voice, and we foster belonging. And so, yeah, that's so much. And I've been running that now for the last 5 years.
Wow. If anybody's interested in learning more about, getting involved, where do they go?
Yeah, well, for EdMC Academy, www.edmc Academy. So it's EDEMCEE Academy. EdMC Academy. For me, www.tonykeithjr.com or just at Tony Keith Jr. on all things.
I guess the final question would be if a parent is on the fence about getting this book for their teen and they're not sure this is the right thing for them, what do you say to them? And what is their young reader, I guess, going to get out of this once they get a chance to open it up?
The first thing I would say is, well, have you ever written or read a poem before? Right? Start there, right? This is the key word on the outside says poet, right? So have you ever met a poet? Do you know poetry? Just start with poetry because that's what they're getting in this book. You're getting poetry in verse, right? The whole book, and also narrated the audiobook. So you're getting the spoken word and the written word, the performance of it. And so yeah, start with the poems.
All right. That's it for this edition of The Color Between the Lines. We appreciate you, Tony Keith, for coming to the BIN.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to have been here. You take care. Peace, love, happiness, everybody.
All right. The book is How the Boogeyman Became a Poet. I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network.